Thank you all for coming to another Talks at Google event this afternoon. Today we're extremely thrilled to host Professor Bob McChesney and John Nichols. They're presenting a talk today, a discussion about their latest book, which is called Dollarocracy, How Money in the Media Election Complex is Destroying America. And I think, especially given the events of recent news and also the sort of state of the continual campaign that's in American politics today, the idea of media literacy is very important, and the balance between free speech and campaign contributions, and what role the media plays in all of this. And so we're really thrilled to bring this dialogue to Google today. Professor McChesney is from my alma mater, the University of Illinois, where he teaches in the communication department, and he's also the president and co-founder of the Free Press. John is a journalist and blogger, and also the associate editor of the Capital Times up in Madison. So we have the Midwest representation here. And so we will have some time at the end for questions. We'll use this mic, so hunt me down if you have a question at the end. Otherwise, please join me in welcoming Bob and John to Google. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming out. It's an honor to be at Talks at Google. We've been in a tour all over the country. This is like our 35th or 40th talk, and we've got about 20 more to go. And the response to the book has been extraordinarily positive. And as you'll see, it's also surprising because it's a very depressing picture we're about to paint on what's going on with our political system and the corruption in it. But the reason why the response has been positive, I think on one hand, is that people recognize the truth of what we're saying. The evidence points fairly strongly in this direction. But the other reason is that John and I both think we're in the moment of change, that really this system can't go on for much longer, and that the great crisis we face in the United States today is that our political system is over here, very much bounded by moneyed interest. But the great bulk of the population isn't with that. They're over here. They want real solutions to real problems that our country faces, and they know that our government needs to provide. And this tension is growing greater and greater by the day. And it's that tension that's going to create the birth, we think, or the rejuvenation of movement to really re-democratize this country, or democratize it much more than it is at present. When we talk about dollarocracy, what we refer to is fairly self-evident. Democracy means the rule of the people, the rule of money, going from the Greeks. Dollarocracy means the rule of money, not the rule of people. $1, one vote, rather than one person, one vote. Those with a great deal of money have tremendous influence over politics. Those with no money have no influence over politics whatsoever. Two recent studies published by Princeton University Press really sort of encapsulated this problem, one by Marty Gillens, another by a team of scholars. They reached independently the exact same conclusion, which is if you look at the Congress of the United States today, none of the decisions that are made reflect the interests of the great majority of the voters of this country, the values of their voters. Representatives routinely ignore what their own constituents want when they deal with their decisions. The decisions are made almost entirely on the behalf of the most wealthy and powerful self-interested parties to the policy or the law or the budget item. The month ago, we were in Washington, D.C., and we had a book launch party. And the person who wrote the foreword to our book graciously introduced us, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders. Bernie has been in the U.S. Senate now 7 years. Before that, he served 8 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. And he said unequivocally, unconditionally, that it is impossible for anything to pass the U.S. Congress if it is opposed by either corporate America or Wall Street. Impossible. They basically have a veto power over all legislation. And that, in a nutshell, is dollarocracy. That's not democracy. Just this last summer, Jimmy Carter, the former president, was meeting with a number of dignitaries from Germany, talking about American and global politics. It was supposed to be an off-the-record meeting. Thanks to the presence of an iPhone, it became an on-the-record meeting. And Carter said, the United States is, quote, no longer a functional democracy. No longer a functional democracy. We are off the democratic grid. We no longer have the rule of law. We no longer have the accountability one associates at the base level with a self-governing or democratic society. And then to top it off, in the book we go through a lot of the polling data and survey data that shows that most Americans are familiar with this. This is not something that shocks Americans. They get it. They understand the powerlessness they have politically, and it's frustrating to them. One survey that's most striking was that almost half of Americans think we would have a better Congress if we simply drew names out of a hat rather than went through the election process. That's a laugh line, but then people think about it and say, maybe not such a bad idea. For those of you who know your history of democratic theory, that's how the ancient Greeks made most of their decisions came through the jury system, not through elections. So at any rate, dollarocracy is the term we have for this, and it has immense consequences. The most obvious ones, the ones we're all familiar with, is corruption. That the decisions that are made in budgets and policies and laws are dominated by self-interested, large, profitable commercial interests. But it also has a lot of other consequences, and they're the consequences that really shape the life of this country going forward until they're addressed, until something is done about dollarocracy. We have seen a massive increase in inequality in the United States in the last 35 years. And this is what you would expect in a dollarocracy. Those at the top rig the system so the funds go to them, the benefits go to them, and the resources don't flow towards the bottom. We've seen an enormous increase in poverty in the last 35 years in the United States. Virtually all the gains we made, which were enormous from the 1920s to the 1960s to reduce poverty, have been lost. We're back at poverty rates and low income rates in the United States today, equivalent to where we were 80 years ago. We've lost almost all our gains in the past generation. Economic stagnation. The certified range of debate over economic policy by the dollarocrats in Washington, D.C. is entirely comfortable with high rates of unemployment and lower real wages for most workers. It's not even debated by either party, by anyone in Washington. It's just a narrow range of debate. That's not much of a future. I mean, basically what we have now, based on current policies, is what we're getting going forward for the great bulk of American people. And then there's another point here that's too often lost. One of the great things about America, one of the things I think all Americans treasure most is our civil liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, right to assemble peacefully. Well, when you lose democracy, when it becomes a dollarocracy, your liberties, those rights we cherish the most, are on softer ground. You still have the right to tattoo something on your forehead or to have a haircut of your choosing, but when you start challenging people in power, what rights really are all about, the ability to stand up to those in power, you're on softer ground. And we've seen, for example, just this last week, a week and a half ago, for the first time in its history, the Committee to Protect Journalists, an organization which defends freedom of the press and journalists' rights worldwide against autocratic governments, for the first time issued a report on harassment of journalists by the US government. First time in its history. And I'd submit that's what you get in dollarocracy. Under dollarocracy, those rights, those freedoms that we once took for granted, to the extent they mix with people in power, suddenly are less secure. Well, the solution, in our view, to dollarocracy is clear. It's democracy. And in this book, what we argue is that the election system, which is the main way citizens have a way to exercise democracy, has been greatly corrupted, and that's really where the problem is. And our book looks at how it's been corrupted. So the ability of the voter, has been reduced tremendously, and money has come to rule it a great deal. Now, our book is fairly depressing. You can always get the vibe right now where I'm going with it, where we're going in the book. But American history is not a constant series of depressing outcomes. Quite the contrary. Between 1900 and 1970, democratic forces, popular forces in the United States, won a number of enormous victories, of huge victories. We won the right to have trade unions. We won Social Security. We won Medicare. We established public education for working class people, vastly superior to almost anywhere in the world. We extended higher education to a higher percentage of the population than anywhere else in the world. We reduced poverty dramatically, and by the 1960s we had less economic inequality than we'd ever had since the Industrial Revolution. We were really, in many respects, moving forward rapidly. Now, it was up and down. There were fights, there were contests. It wasn't all wins, but it wasn't all defeats either. By the end of the 1960s, and I was a teenager then, they did a survey in 1970 of all the teenagers in the world, and they found out that American teenagers were among the three most optimistic groups of teenagers in the world. The other two were Israeli and Chilean. Chile fell off the list a few years later, and America fell off the list too. We're way down the list now when they do those surveys, in 40, 50, 60, 70. We're nowhere near the top. And I was a teenager then, and I remember the optimism we had. We thought this country had the capacity to solve its problems. We made all this progress, and we were within eyesight of a much better world, with even less inequality, less poverty, more opportunity, more justice, less militarism, and less war. But not everyone was optimistic in the early 1970s. In particular, the leading lights in the business community were deeply concerned by what they saw going on in America at that time. They were concerned that America was not sufficiently reverential towards traditional business domination of politics. They were deeply concerned that the most honored and respected person in American life in 1970 across the political spectrum was Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, whose vision was that public service was a highest serving calling a person could do, to serve others. And that people could work together and democratically have the government solve problems effectively on behalf of all the people. The government did not have to be a source of corruption or tyranny. That was Nader's message. And this scared the business community to death, which saw its stature in the country probably at its lowest ebb in generations by the early 1970s, especially, interestingly enough, among middle class and upper middle class students. College students, who traditionally were the backbone of business society, suddenly had a marked increase in concern that whether corporations, large corporations, weren't the best way to structure an economy for a free society. In the early 1970s, the US Chamber of Commerce commissioned a confidential memo to be distributed among 5 or 6 dozen leading CEOs and investors to deal with what they termed the political crisis of our time. And they termed it the crisis of democracy. And the crisis of democracy to them was that there was too much democracy. The crisis of democracy was that women, African Americans, young people, young workers who traditionally had been apathetic and not concerned with politics had gotten too engaged in politics. Were making demands on the system really couldn't accommodate. We had to get them back on the couches, back and apathetic, back and unconcerned with politics. And the US Chamber of Commerce commissioned the leading corporate attorney in America at that time to write a memo. And this attorney's name is Lewis Powell, who made a vast fortune representing firms, especially the US tobacco industry. And the Powell memo, you can Google it after the talk. It's up there. It's 6 pages long. It was done in 1971. It was a blueprint, basically, for how corporations can take over the government of the country with the goal of making it very simple. No matter who wins the election, we win. Business domination of society is never in question, whichever party wins. That was the mission of it. And what Powell argued was that business needed to devote immense resources to lobbying and politics. And in the 2 decades following the memo, there was a 10-fold increase, 10 times increase in lobbying and political spending by corporations. 10-time increase in the number of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. The term K Street, which didn't exist before 1971, became a term like Wall Street or Madison Avenue to signify an enormous industry. Washington, D.C., which had been a sleepy backwater town without much wealth compared to the Clevelands or the Bay Areas or the New Yorks or the Philadelphias of the world, suddenly, after the influx of corporate money and the lobbying, became a very different community. Today, 4 or 5 of the 10 richest counties in the United States are the suburbs ringing Washington, D.C. And those aren't government bureaucrats living there. They're the people K Street. They're the corporate people living there and all their ancillary people. So they succeeded. Now, one thing that Powell was insistent on in his memo, that they needed to build groups that would sort of buttress the ideological and political power of corporations. Heritage Foundation, Cato, American Enterprise Institute came immediately following this. ALEC, a group that you're learning more about here at Google apparently, came immediately after this. And then most importantly, Powell said, we've got to do something about the Supreme Court. Even when we have Republican presidents who are pro-business, like Eisenhower and Nixon, they're appointing these guys like Earl Warren and Harry Blackmun. And they get a lifetime appointment, and they get carried away with the First Amendment and this sort of idea of expanding democracy. We've got to get guys in the court. When we put them on the court, we know they will always understand business first, business always, business has to dominate. So they set up something called the Federal Society to be a training ground for their attorneys so they could count on them when they got in the court. And as fate would have it, 2 months after this Powell memo was distributed confidentially and engendered a great deal of discussion internally in the business community, there was an opening on the US Supreme Court. And who should President Nixon decide to appoint? Lewis Powell. He became the next judge in the Supreme Court. So he had a chance to swing right into action and implement his ideas as a member of the US Supreme Court. And Powell's signature issue from the moment he came to the court was the idea there should be unlimited spending by corporations and wealthy people on politics. That was his immediate issue. He was obsessed with that. He was never able to win that fight on the Supreme Court while he was on it because the Chief Justice at the time, William Rehnquist, was an old-fashioned conservative. He didn't believe corporations were people. He didn't believe the Supreme Court should mess with the structure of elections to play favorites. He opposed the effort to have unleashed money. But by the time John Roberts replaced Rehnquist in 2010, all that changed. John Roberts was a Federalist Society superstar. He was committed to unlimited spending by business and billionaires and trade unions. And for those of the younger people here, Ask some of the old people what trade unions are. They're these things we used to have back in the 60s and 70s that gave workers some higher income than they have today. And the Citizens United decision came on in 2010, and that's really what drove this book. Because with Citizens United, what we saw was businesses, unions, and billionaires could spend unlimited amounts on political campaigns as long as the money didn't go officially to the campaign itself. It went to a third-party group that was not associated with the campaign but could be linked to it informally, as we learned in 2012. And as a result, we saw in the last election, 2012 in the United States, we spent $10.3 billion in all our elections, double what was spent in 2008 in all the elections in America, 10 times what was spent 20 years ago, even factoring inflation. We're huge increase in spending. Now, the Supreme Court argued this huge increase in spending would be a good thing because there would just be more civic virtue. More money is more speech, more involvement by people. But there's a fundamental problem with that argument. There's a big difference between anyone in this room giving $50, $100, $200, even $1,000 to a candidate and someone giving 100 times or 1,000 times that. It goes from being a civic contribution to being an investment with an expected outcome commercially. All the evidence has always pointed that way. All the evidence continues to point that way. Now, it's difficult to fully get the evidence on that in the short term because most of the people are dropping lots of money, and much of this money is now anonymous, as we chronicle in the book. There's no records that are kept. Don't want to be publicized. If you drop, $50 or $100 million on a referendum case on labeling of foods in California, for example, you don't really want to necessarily advertise who you are. You want to keep it on the down low as much as possible. You just want to win. But fortunately for us, in doing our research, there was one major donor who gave $200 million in the last election cycle who enjoyed the publicity and reveled in it. He's from Las Vegas, Nevada. His name is Shelley Adelson. You might have heard of him. Shelley dropped $200 million, as I said. And after the election, everyone said, well, poor Shelley, he lost $200 million. He had a rough year. All his candidates lost. Well, not all of them. In Michigan, there was a referendum on the ballot to make the right to have collective bargaining part of the Michigan Constitution, so the government couldn't take away that right from workers. It looked like it was going to win. Michigan, after all, is the backbone of the labor movement in the United States. In the last few weeks, Shelley took an interest in that state, in that race, and dropped a few $1,000,000 quickly to run negative ads against it, and they were able to defeat it at the last second. So he won some things. He didn't lose everything. Shelley Adelson had a very interesting interview after the 2012 election. He went to Washington so all the Republicans could kiss his ring. And the Washington Post interviewed him, and the reporter said, what are your politics, Shelley Adelson? What motivates you? He said, well, these are my political values. I believe in socialized medicine. I believe in stem cell research. I'm concerned about the climate crisis. I think probably have to do something about that. I believe in science. I believe in a woman's right to choose. I believe in gay rights and gay marriage. And the reporter is dumbfounded. Are you the same Shelley Adelson who just gave $200 million to Rick Santorum and all these lunatics? And I'm paraphrasing here. And he said, yeah. He said, I don't give money to politics for those reasons. When I give money to politics, I've got three basic concerns. Number one, I hate labor unions. I have a non-union shop. I'm a billionaire. I don't want to have the unions in my shop. So I'm for politicians who are going to make sure we don't have to worry about labor unions. Number two, I'm worth $30 billion. I don't like paying taxes. That's for the little people. I want politicians to keep my taxes low. And for what I spend, I get a 1% drop in my tax rate. It more than pays for whatever I give any politician. And number three, I run gambling casinos. You might know that that's sort of a dubious enterprise to a lot of people. And some of the stuff I'm doing in my East Asia casinos, people are looking at as maybe being a little in the gray area of legality. I prefer to have a government that's not going to look very hard at that. That's why I give $200 million. I'm worth $30 billion. I want to be worth $60 billion. I don't want to be worth $10 billion or in jail. And so you've laid it out. It's all about investment. And when the Citizens United decision unleashed the money from the Shelley Adelsons of the world, it had no effect on the 99.99% of Americans who were in no position to give more than $100,000 or $200,000 a year to elections. It was all about Shelley Adelson and a few thousand other people who can drop $200 million. It was their liberation pact. It was for them to be able to buy elections. That's what that decision did. It had no effect on 99.9% of Americans, zero. But for Shelley, it was great. Now let's think about that money. So we outspend most countries by a great deal of money. Germany, as you might know, recently had a national election. Just a month ago, they re-elected their Christian Democratic government. And John Nichols and I went through and we did the math. We figured out how much did Germany spend in their campaigns, all their politicians, all their candidates, per voter, how much did they spend in the German national election this year? And how did that compare to how much American politicians, parties, and third-party groups spent on our election in 2012. For every dollar they spent in Germany this year, for every dollar on campaigns for their national elections, we spent $32 on our national elections, congressional and presidential, in 2012. 32 to 1 ratio. And from our research, basically that's pretty much the ratio everywhere around the world. It's sometimes down to 8 or 9 or 10 to 1, but the larger the country is, the more it gets up. Britain was 29 to 1 for their 2010 election compared to us in 2012. We spend unbelievable amounts of money compared to these other countries. Now, according to Citizens United, that should give us the best elections in the world. We're outspending them, all that speech, all that public involvement. Well, think about that. Imagine we outspent Germany 32 to 1 in elementary school education in America. What would it be like? Take what Germany spends to educate a first grader and say we outspent them by 32 times. What would an American elementary school look like in Oakland today? You'd have 1 teacher, you'd have 4 students, you'd have 4 assistant teachers, you'd have a music teacher, an art teacher, a gym teacher, a personal trainer, a masseuse. I mean, you'd have this unbelievable network of people to educate our kids. Every kid in America would get an education equal to Bill Gates' kid, if not better. 32 to 1 spending advantage over Germany. It would be unbelievable. So what happens when you outspend a country 32 to 1 on elections? Unbelievable? Yeah, unbelievable, but in the other direction. We have the worst elections in the world. Jimmy Carter has said, again, and the Carter Center monitors elections. They've monitored 92 elections the last 25 years to make sure they're on the up and up. Jimmy Carter said that the United States has arguably the worst election system in the world. He said that if the Carter Center was asked to monitor an American election, they would refuse to do so because we don't meet the baseline credibility level you have to have that Venezuela meets, that Ukraine meets, that Belarus meets. We don't meet that baseline criteria that they would hold a country to that they could trust the outcome of the election. That's what Carter said. Our elections are deplorable by international standards. We get the lowest turnout rate in the world among major countries. Germany had a 72% turnout. Norway, 3 weeks before that our national election, 82%. We had just under 53% of 18-year-olds and older vote in our 2012 election. People were ecstatic, 53%. Unbelievable, we're very low. And where does the money go? And this is really why so much has been spent. The money goes overwhelmingly to television political advertising. And this is much of what our book's about, because it is really it's become the lingua franca of American politics. In 1776, the book that drove most Americans to be willing to fight to make this country independent was a pamphlet by Tom Paine called Common Sense. And it was the most widely read book of its period, perhaps even more so than the Bible. And in the first sentence of that book, it says, "A long habit of not thinking something wrong gives it the superficial appearance of being right." And that's how most of us are about American politics. We're so inundated in the idea of political advertising as the lingua franca, we think that's what democracy is. That's what we think democratic elections are. Wrong. It's not like that at all. Not like that at all. Political advertising is outlawed in all the countries I just named. You can't do it in Germany. You can't do it in Norway. They don't allow it to be spent. That's where we spent $6 of our $10 billion last time on these political ads, which are of extraordinarily dubious value. In other countries like Britain, they're considered to political campaigns what germ warfare is considered to conventional warfare. They're considered simply outside the boundaries of a healthy democracy and unacceptable. But in this country, that's what we have. And in this country, increasingly what we have are negative ads. Ads that basically are all about attacking the opponent in a scurrilous manner with a factual basis that is laughable at the most part. I could go on and on. I think you get the hint of where we're going. The good news, though, we are on a chance of changing it. The bad news, though, is that the one institution that normally would be at the front of leading us would be our news media, our political journalism, which would draw people in, make them aware. And the crisis we talk about in the book is not only of our election system, but it's of the collapse of journalism as we know it in the United States in the last 20 years. The resources going to journalism have plummeted. In most communities we go to, there are maybe 35% the number of paid reporters there were, including digital, from 1990 or 1992. In some communities, it's much less. There's just not much journalism left. The commercial communities decided you can't make money doing it. They're not doing it. Most people who go to vote now, they have no information whatsoever about most of the races on the ballot. What little journalism you get for the races at the top is usually just regurgitating the claims in the TV ads and discussing them and how effective they are. Very little about the actual candidates or policies. So very much the crisis of dollarocracy is the crisis of the loss and collapse of journalism. And the solution to the crisis is not only changing our election laws changing our Constitution to guarantee the right to vote, but also creating a healthy, vibrant, independent news media. And on that note, I'd like to introduce my co-author, John Nichols.
Bob McChesney. Can everybody hear this well? Bob's a little taller than I, and I thought the microphone was not particularly well set up for him. And I'm hoping I will project well enough so everybody can hear you, because we've come to Google to ask you to work, not merely to listen. And a huge part of our research, and I know this guy's sitting up front saying, hey, I work all the rest of the day. I don't want to be told to do more here. No, I mean, look, you're a unique bunch of people. Do you understand? It's not every corporation in America where midday, when you have a lunch break, you come out and sit in the middle of the operation and listen to people pontificate about the politics and the functioning of democracy. So right off the bat, you have self-selected yourself into a unique grouping. You also created the technology that makes it possible for Eric over there to look up the Powell Memo and actually read it as Bob talked about it. And that's a huge part of where we are at as a democracy today. People rely on what you do to get information. Now, that's a little bit tragic. That's not a perfect scenario, because you understand that in a functioning democracy, information ought to come from all sorts of different directions, and people shouldn't have to work particularly hard to find out about what's going on. Because despite the fact that Eric looked up the memo and got all his information, by and large, most people still get their information about democracy from local television news. Now, I'm not going to ask you to watch your local television news. That would be an unreasonable request of any functioning human. But just for an experiment tonight, if you get a chance, pop it on. And look at what most Americans get as the input of information as regards democracy. They're not even getting sufficient information to get them to know what to Google to find out more about their democracy. When they watch their local evening news, what they get in most of this country is weather. A lot of weather. In fact, the fact of the matter is, I don't even understand how you can have weather reports in California. But I have watched it here. And no, I come from Wisconsin. We have weather. It's going to snow tonight. And so, but if you watch the local evening news, it begins with, I don't care what's going on. The government is shut down, debt ceiling crisis, death, grief, hate, sorrow, whatever. They'll tell you something big, and then they'll say, but first we're going to let you know about the weather. And they will go to a very handsome or attractive person who will sit there and say, well, today we had a lot of weather. And I'll be back to tell you more about it after the break. And then they give you a huge amount of commercials. And then they do, kind of the smash and grab news of the day. Death, grief, sorrow, robbery, car crash, traffic jam, death, grief, sorrow, robbery, car crash, traffic jam. Most newscasts have about 27 stories mentioned. Everybody thinks, when we ask people, they often say, oh, a newscast, they probably do 3 or 4 stories. No, they do about 27 hits, but it's all just reading one line after another, right? And it's invariably something horrible going on someplace that makes you really dislike and distrust your neighbors. And so once they've got done with that, though, jamming that in, not enough time to cover the school board or the city council or the state legislature, mind you, then they get back to the weather. And that's where they let loose. That's where you're going to get your detailed and useful information. They're going to tell you that in Mountain View, it was 73 degrees today. But up in South San Francisco, it was 70. And over in Palo Alto, it was 71, if you can believe it. And then they're going to go all through the region. You know this, right? Because one time you watched the local evening news. And so they go all around with all that stuff, right? And then they give you the barometric pressure, which I've covered journalism I've been a journalist for 30 years. I've watched the evening news in every place, not just in this country, but in 25 countries around the world. I have no idea what barometric pressure is, but I understand it's important, and they tell you all about it every night. And then what do? This is the important part. right? In the 7 to 8 minutes devoted to weather, they go, well, over here across the Pacific, around Thailand, there seems to be a storm stirring up. And if the wind blows the right way, it might come up across the Pacific, and I don't know, in a couple weeks, we might have some rain. And remember, because they do this, they look across the whole, they tell you weather patterns and stuff, and you're like, wow, this must be the most important stuff in my life. This must be what really matters. As a citizen, I have to know this in order to function. And then they throw in a bunch more commercials, and then after the bunch of commercials, because you're there with bated breath to know what the weather will be tomorrow, they go around the whole map again, and they say in Palo Alto tomorrow, it's very likely to be, well, 73. And up in South San Francisco, 71. But take a look at this. Mountain View, looking like it might get to 75 tomorrow. We're not sure, but we'll be keeping an eye on that. And so they've done 7, 8 minutes of this. Right, 7, 8 minutes of our vital, the central place where the average American gets their information about politics and governance on the weather. There's only one problem. The weather is free. The weather doesn't require any journalism. The weather is created by the government. I know, you're like, hold it. They invited another nut into Google. No, the weather comes from the National Weather Service. You, the taxpayers, pay for the collection of all that information, and it's given. The TV stations get it for free. They don't pay for it. And so they give you 7 or 8 minutes of no journalism. No, they don't even go out and check the thermometer. And then at the end of that newscast, they say, well, you know everything you need to know. Go out there and decide who should be the president, who should be your senator, how we should run our local governments, how we should feel about major issues in this country. We have a journalism stand down in America. It is a crisis. Local TV, main source, but look at newspapers. Newspapers in this country have laid off 22,000 employees since 2009. And every one of them blames Google. So just be aware that they all are like, oh, it's the internet. But you know what the problem was? I got good news for Google. They were laying them off before. The fact of the matter is the crisis in newspaper journalism it started in 1950. And we have had a steady decline in the number of newspapers in this country since the 50s. And it was television much more than the internet that caused this crisis. What the internet did was take the ads away. And this is a big deal, because journalism in America for a long time was sustained by ads. And everybody thought, wow, what wonderful people. All those big companies, the car companies and the soda companies, they just give all this money to newspapers and television and radio to sustain journalism. Well, it turns out, ironically enough, they didn't. They gave that money because that was the vehicle by which they could get to you. And so you got a newspaper, you looked at it, you didn't want to look at the ad for the diapers, but, you know, okay. And so then the next thing, that's how they sold stuff. TV, the same way. It doesn't happen that way anymore. That's not how it works. I get my little phone here. Even when I'm on Twitter, I was tweeting about this incredible event. And I've got little ads coming on Twitter now. The ads find me. And if you know this, I don't have to tell you this. The ads follow people around. The bottom line is the ads don't go. The ads don't go in the newspaper anymore. They don't go, by and large, on TV anymore. And so you have this deep decline in journalism. It's one set of ads that do come in. One set of ads do come in. And that's the political ads. And you know why? Because, and you're just a screwed up bunch. We got a couple of white-haired folks, and I love you. But by and large, you're too young to vote. In this country, the voting class is old people. Quite old. That's why we can't talk about anything but Social Security in this country, because the fact of the matter is our voting class is overwhelmingly old. And people think just about presidential elections. No, you got to go down that food chain into local politics. Bob talked about a 52% turnout. Well, 52%, 53% of our voting age population, that's the mountaintop. You go into state and local elections, you start creeping down to numbers that are in literally 20, 18, 17, 16, 15, 10% turnouts. We just elected Cory Booker to the U.S. Senate from New Jersey in a 20% turnout election. That means if you met 5 people on the street, 4 of them didn't vote. Well, roughly half of them voted for Cory Booker. That means he's going to the United States Senate, the most elite club in the world, with the support of 10% of the electorate in the state he's going to represent. So we've got this huge stand down By and large, people who do vote, very much older, they still watch that television evening news. And so what do they get? All the weather they can possibly use, and then $6 billion worth of ads. I don't think I have to explain to people as smart as you that what that leaves us with is in the ideal propaganda circumstance, right? No information for the voting class that's of any particular consequence, but a massive inflow of ads. And what do those ads do? What do they tell people to do? Don't vote. No, don't imagine that political ads are put on TV to get people to vote. That's not the point. Because remember, we have a small voting class. We have depressed our voting class down. And if, as we talk about in the book, in many races, as much as 90 to 95% of the ads are negative, and ask yourself this. I'm going to take this guy right here. Well, I'm going to say you're a sophisticated urban intellectual, right? You vote on a variety of issues that concern you deeply. I'm going to make assumptions about you, and I probably am wrong. But I'm going to assume you believe that people have a right to make choices at what they do with their own body. You believe that social, engineering by the right wing, I don't want that. I'm not going to vote for some, right wing Rick Santorum for president of the United States. That's just not where I'm going, okay? Because I got the cool glasses. That's not who I'm going to be. All right, cool. So you see a negative ad about the candidate you decided to vote for. You're going to vote for this kind of progressive candidate you sort of like. They're thinking liberally on a whole bunch of things. You see a negative ad about that candidate, and you're like, whoa, that's it. I'm voting for the social conservative. I'm going to vote against everything I believe in because I saw a negative ad about my candidate. That's not what happens. You see enough negative ads about that candidate, you say, pox on all their houses, I'm just not going to vote, right? And you stand down. We talk a lot in this country about voter suppression, about voter ID laws, and about other efforts to make it hard to vote. The number one voter suppression in America is negative ads, because negative ads tell tens of millions of Americans in the primary place where they are getting information about politics still, don't vote. Don't vote for the candidate you wanted to vote for because it turns out that they are the most evil person in the world. And we actually did this for the book. We watched these ads. California, right? They don't campaign in California anymore, right? So because you guys figured things out, right? So bottom line is they go to the handful of states where they're like this incredible creature, the undecided voter, and many of them live in the Midwest where I'm from. These are the kind of people that can't decide whether, I don't know, should I get up this morning? And so the end result is, so they pour these ads into these states here. They are really awful. They are unbelievably troubling things. I mean, it's like, slasher films, nothing compared to this stuff. And so people are inundated with this, and it tells them to stand down from politics. It's a really serious issue, and this issue gets more serious by the minute, because in this country, we have a bigger and bigger divide between the engaged, handful of engaged people, the people who do, they're like Eric over here, they're looking stuff up. He's probably looking up the turnout numbers right now. And so we have a handful of hyper-engaged people, but then we have a growing disconnect in this country. And it's why it is possible. It is why it is possible for people to shut down the government. It is why it is possible for us to have huge crises in Washington about things that, and you're a relatively young guy here. I know it's going to shock you. Old people like me, when I was growing up, I never knew there was such a thing as a continuing resolution. I never knew there was such a thing as a debt ceiling. I didn't know about government shut. I covered journalism forever, or politics forever. I didn't know that. That never happened. Now it's all we talk about. Why is it all we talk about? Because when we have depressed down our political participation, when we have squeezed information out of the game, we create a game for a handful of people, a tiny number of people who participate in gerrymandered political circumstances. Remember, now in America, it's the opposite of what we think about. Generally voters choose the candidates. In America, the candidates, the politicians choose their districts. They choose their set of voters. So you're a certain Democrat, you pick, here's how we're going to draw the lines. The legislatures, California's tried to break some of that, but most of the country, that's what they do. So the end result is across this country, when you have a Congress, and remember, this Congress didn't win, by the way, this is an important thing to understand. Last year, 1.7 million more people voted for Democrats for the House of Representatives than voted for Republicans. But because of the gerrymandering, because of structural flaws in how we do our elections, the Republicans have control of the House. Not because more people wanted them to, but because of the structures of how we do our politics. The end result is that those people who are there, everybody said, well, why don't the Republicans stand down? Why don't they realize this is incredibly unpopular? The Gallup poll just showed that the Republican Party has a lower approval rating today than at any time since Gallup started polling on the approval of major parties. No, it's unbelievable. And yet they didn't. There are a lot of them. Ted Cruz is still saying, I didn't do anything wrong, you know? And why? Because they don't fear November elections. They don't fear the mass turnout. They've drawn the districts, they've structured the money, they've structured the politics, so the only problem they've got is their primary. They don't want to be challenged by somebody who is more extreme than they are. And so as a result, you end up with a situation where your entire politics, the governance of the nation, is defined by people who are afraid of people who are crazier than they are. That, I want to tell you, is not a healthy democracy. This is, amazingly enough, this is not what Jefferson and Madison imagined back in 1787. And so as we approach all these issues, we realize we're not at the full crisis point yet. We are moving rapidly toward it. Because this next election cycle, we had $10 billion. And by the way, here's a little something for Google to do. When we started the research on this, one of you could do this. I'm sorry, because I have such reverence for you. One of you could do this. Do you know that there's no agency in America that charts all the money that's spent? It's independent. The Federal Election Commission doesn't begin to do it. Independent groupings do it at the federal or state level. Nobody does it nationwide, what all is spent. We did it for our book. It was incredibly hard. It took the better part of a year. We went state by state, community by community. What we saw was huge amounts of money flooded into local races where you get the most power, where you decide on zoning, where you decide on delivery of services and things like that. A San Jose race where they spent $500,000 for a city council seat. California referendums. Last year in California, $550 million was spent on referendums in California, these initiatives, particularly to tell you that you don't want to know whether your food is genetically modified. And so the end result of this is that we come into this situation at a very troubling point, a point where it could get a lot worse. And what we propose is to think like you folks think, I hope. I hope I'm not making too much of an assumption. And that is, you don't look at a problem from the standpoint of what everybody's done up to this point to solve the problem. You don't narrow your options. You say, how do we fix the crisis? What we need to do in America is do massive interventions in how we communicate. We have to figure out how to democratize the flow of information so that working class people, the mom who works at a Wendy's window and then has to go home and put 3 kids to sleep and then has to go out that night and work at the McDonald's window, how she gets enough information to be a participant in our democratic life. How it is not cut off from her and all she sees is negative ads. So we have to think a lot about that, but we also have to think a lot about how to renew our democracy. And this is big deal stuff. We have to amend our Constitution. There's nothing wrong with that. I know when somebody says amend the Constitution, say that's impossible, it's never been done. The Constitution was written in stone, handed down on tablets to Michelle Bachmann, and it's never been altered. Well, except for 27 times. 27 times we've amended our Constitution. The founders amended it 10 times in the first 4 years of the Republic. And then about a decade later, when the vice president shot the Secretary of the Treasury, they decided to amend it again to pick a different way of getting vice presidents. And so we have amended the Constitution throughout our history as a country. We have amended it most often to make our democracy work. Everybody loves the New Deal. We talk about Roosevelt. One of the lost realities of the New Deal era was at the start of the New Deal era, they did 2 amendments to the Constitution that no one ever talks about. Eric can look them up. And the one amendment said that when a president is elected, instead of being sworn in the spring, he's sworn in January. That moved the process down. Remember we talked, some older folks will remember the story of Roosevelt's first 100 days? We made possible the meaning of a first 100 days by collapsing in the time between the election and when you became president. That was huge. The other thing we did was say that the Congress of the United States met immediately in January rather than deep into the next year. Previously, before that, the way the Constitution was structured, Congress was elected. The people who were elected did not come in to sit until well into the next year. As a result, those who had been defeated actually governed for the better part of a year after the election. We changed these things to make our democracy work. And we did a lot of other changes. We gave women the right to vote. After the Civil War, we gave African American men the right to vote. We gave Native Americans the right to vote. In 1962, in the lifetime of some people in this room, we struck down the wealth barrier to voting in this country. We banned the poll tax constitutionally in 1962. 1970, we said that people are 18 to 21 years old who go off and fight in wars, get drafted to die in foreign lands, ought to be able to vote in the elections that would determine whether we fight those wars. We have amended our Constitution again and again and again in this country to repair the problems of our democracy. And the great gap today is that because our media is so bad, because it doesn't cover politics, our media covers Washington, it covers dysfunction in Washington, most people don't know that we are in another constitutional moment. 16 American states have formally petitioned the Congress of the United States to overturn the Citizens United ruling and to say corporations are not people, money is not speech, and we, the citizens of the United States, have a right to form elections in which the vote matters more than the dollar. 16 American states have already done this. 500 communities across the country have done this. Los Angeles did it earlier this year. San Francisco's already done it. I wouldn't be surprised if Mountain View has done it. But the fact of the matter is, there is this huge cry across this country to make the change. And the interesting thing is, it's not just Democrats and liberals. The fact of the matter is, everybody gets this. Last year, they put referendums on the ballot in Montana and in Colorado. Colorado was an Obama state. Montana was a Romney state. They had a referendum on constitutional amendment. Each state voted roughly 73% in favor of doing it. Republican members of legislatures across this country have worked with Democrats to encourage this. Recently, we got the first Republican in Congress, Walter Jones, a deep, passionate conservative from the Carolinas, to sign on and say, we need this constitutional amendment. Because if we don't make democracy changes to our Constitution, as hard as it is with all the barriers that are out there, we cannot begin to structure the money out and to structure the people in. So that's the bottom line. I come and ask you, think of yourselves as founders. Think of yourselves as people who want to shape an actual democracy in this country. And then, because of your special genius, think of yourselves as people who can help to form a communication system in this country that makes sure everybody can vote and everybody can cast an informed vote. Big deal stuff. We're glad to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Mike here for questions.
Madison native, former writer for the Simpson Street Free Press.
No way.
Oh yeah.
All right, brother. How old are you?
I'm 28.
So you probably were wandering around the Cap Times newsroom sometimes trying to.
Oh yeah, Evju Foundation.
Evju, yeah.
Evju, sorry.
Thank you.
Evju.
No, it's totally, yeah.
I actually first saw you speak at the Fighting Bob Fest in Baraboo like 12 years ago.
The rest of you can leave
Sorry,
now.
this is
the
like
rest
Wisconsin.
of you can leave now. It's okay.
This is Wisconsin progressive trivia for you. My question centers more around media.
Yeah.
So with Bezos purchasing the Washington Post, and it's been announced that Pierre Omidyar is launching this huge, like $250 million project in conjunction with some former Guardian reporters.
With Glenn Greenwald, who did the NSA
Glenn.
stuff, perhaps with Jeremy Scahill, my colleague from The Nation, some other folks.
So, a lot of what you guys just spoke about centers around what has happened to media, how newsrooms have been gutted. Folks that rely on their 5 o'clock news aren't getting the news that we would like them to get. How do you see media changing? You guys have an inside view, and I'm really curious to see, what do the next 5 to 20 years of media look like? And what do you think that, especially a long-term tech vision can bring to an industry that has been so depleted by market forces?
Yeah.
I'm going to let Bob do this one, but before you do, you've just asked literally the top media scholar in the world to do a minute on the future of media.
Real quickly, John talked about this. The reason why Jeff Bezos was able to buy the Washington Post for $250 million, when had he wanted to buy it 10 years ago, it would have cost him $6 billion, is that the market has determined that commercial journalism is no longer profitable. And the reason for that's what John started talking about. Advertising online no longer has to support content. It's been detached from content. And journalism for the last 100 years received between 50 and 100% of its revenues from advertising. Well, online, you paste your ads through a network. The website gets far less percentage of the revenue than it used to. In 2003, a newspaper website got 100% of its ad revenues from its advertising. By 2010, it was down to 20%. Today, it's under 10 and it's approaching zero, like a parabola. So there's not a commercial market left, which is why Bezos got it for such little money. In our view, and to sum up really quickly, this is a fundamental political issue for this country. How are we going to have the resources to have competing independent newsrooms covering our communities, drawing us into public life? And it's a political issue because the market has voted. And the solution, in our view, is by looking at how other democracies address it in Europe and East Asia, and also how the United States addressed it the 100 years before we had advertising provide the lion's share of support for journalism, when we had the greatest free press system in the world. And what we had then were massive postal and printing subsidies which spawned this incredible press system. And what we find in other countries is enlightened policies in places like Germany, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden that spawn an independent, uncensored free press, and also supports diverse newspapers in communities too. I'm not saying we should adopt their policies, but we have to start having that discussion. Because the market will not generate independent journalism. That has been voted by the marketplace emphatically.
And let me just to come off that for one other thing. And I'm going to go whack job libertarian on you here, okay? Because in our book we talk about a lot of different fixes for media. And I do recommend the book. It makes a fine holiday gift. But to cut to the chase, one of the best ideas we've seen came from an economist named Dean Baker. And he said, look, the underpinning of democracy is information. An informed vote is what matters. It's not just a vote. To make you just rubber stamping stuff, that's not the point. You have to have information. It's so important that we ought to give every American $100 credit or tax write-off that they can direct to any independent not-for-profit media at the local, state, or national level, and they can make the choices. They can sustain media. Other countries actually experiment with this, Sweden and others, where they look at some of these sort of tax credits, other models where you can support media that you regard well. And in fact, the United States experiments with it all the time. We allow billionaires and stock speculators to write off their subscription to the Wall Street Journal because it's considered vital information for your economic life. You can write it right off. Academics can write off the journals that they read for their academic work. Citizens can't write off what they want their support for media. We think an idea like that, which would build a left-right coalition, we would hope, would be a good way to start. And then you ask us. We're thrilled to come to Google because we want you people to think about, genuinely to start to think about how to do this. But what we'll tell you is there is a political part to this. You have to recognize that. And one of the best ways, one of the best models for it is to say, why don't you create great ideas for how to do all this, and let us create a model where citizens can then sustain, in a very open, free way, the journalism they like. You're sitting, by the way, down the row from Craig Aaron, who is the president and CEO of Free Press, the group that we've co-founded.
He's working on these issues. And
Free Press works on all these issues all the time. And so I would recommend check out their website. Throw off the things you don't like. Don't buy into the things you don't like, but explore these ideas because we genuinely need a lot of smart people in the mix of figuring out how we create a communication system that sustains democracy.
So many fascinating issues. We could talk for hours about all of them, I'm sure. The one I wanted to ask you about, though, was the 28th Amendment that you're proposing. Mm-hmm. I totally share your, I think, values and objectives there, yet I do remain a little bit skeptical about the limitation on using money. You know, this is the way that people speak in this country oftentimes. And, you know, there were issues where I agree with the funding, a billionaire coming in, whether it's Larry or Sergey funding something on a carbon tax. So I'm wondering, you know, why not have a thing where you do the first part of it, where you say only entities that can vote in this election can contribute. Mm-hmm. Any person who can vote can contribute unlimitedly with disclosure. and I know Supreme Court's trying to fight some of the disclosure parts of this. What would be the problem with that? It seems to me that that preserves, free speech as well as freedom of association that I think are very vital. Footnote, like, our values are winning, actually. Like, if you read things like Victory Lab, we can spend the money better. So why would we want to, from a utilitarian point of view, unilaterally disarm?
Let me take a quick piece of that and let Bob take it. Eric, I love you. You're my man. You were looking up the Powell memo there. Come on. And you're doing exactly what we want you to do. When we come out, we don't specify a specific amendment. We actually think there's several amendments that ought to be done. We think a Supreme Court that tells you that money should flow easily into politics, but it should be hard to vote, is wrong on several counts. So we would like to not only do an amendment as regards the money, we would also like to do an amendment that says everybody has a right to vote and a right to have that vote counted. But what you've just done is exactly what we want. You are talking about how you would sculpt that amendment. And the fact of the matter is, every amendment to the Constitution of any consequence has not come about wholly formed at the beginning. It ends up with people starting to think about the idea, thinking about what they want to surrender, what they want to defend, and making something real. And so I don't disregard a lot of what you say, although Bob may toss you off completely. But what I will tell you is that kind of engagement is where we have to be. Our problem in America is we're not having those discussions. We're not talking about how to structurally make this thing work. And the final thing I'll tell you about constitutional amendments, this is a big deal. When you talk about a constitutional amendment, you don't always have to get it to fix the problem. This is the interesting thing. When we had the Equal Rights Amendment, the women in the room will be aware that it's not been enacted. We don't have an Equal Rights Amendment to our Constitution. But the multi-year fight to get an Equal Rights Amendment helped to open the door for Title IX, for workplace protections for women, for Lilly Ledbetter Act, and a host of other breakthroughs. On the right and the left, a constitutional amendment strategy does not have to be completed in order to begin to address the crisis along the way. But if you don't shoot big, if you don't go for to say, this is such a serious issue, we have to talk about it in this way, you don't possibly get to the incremental changes along the way.
Well, I think the problem with unlimited spending is what I talked about already. I won't repeat it. Is the difference between a small spending and a large spending. And the other problem is that it also reinforces the idea that politics is for billionaires and really wealthy people, and we're best to get to be spectators. If you have money, you can buy in and be a player. If you don't, you just hope that your team wins. You root for the billionaire you most agree with. And I don't think that's a healthy thing. I think that we look at how other democracies that are much more successful, by all the criteria, whoever makes them, wealthy people have a lot of influence in society. They don't need to buy elections. They can start groups. They can do education campaigns. There's lots of ways they can influence politics if that's their goal. The election process should be kept as much as possible a level playing field. That really is sort of mandatory for democracy to be credible and succeed. And that's what we've lost in this country. Now, your other point, though, I completely agree with. It's the premise of our book is that this is not a reactionary country. This is not a dumb country. This is not a country that buys in. The great tension here is when we go around to talks, this is the smallest room we've played in 40 talks. People get it. They're concerned. This is a progressive country. Young people in particular are really cued in that we've got to change this governing system. It's not working. And that's why we're so optimistic. And I think the key I would close with, if we're getting near the witching hour, is that it's striking that in the last 5 years, this great movement's been on two fronts politically. One is to unleash the power of unlimited money by the wealthiest institutions and individuals. On the other hand, the Supreme Court has worked hard, and state governments have worked hard to make it harder and harder for poor people and people of color to vote, literally reenacting Jim Crow statutes now in 5 southern states, something that is obscene. It would have been illegal 2 years ago. The reason why they're doing that, making it easy for money to flood elections, making it harder for poor people to get to the polls, is they know they can't win a fair election. That system is really that fragile. We just need to organize, and we will win. We need to recognize that we have the numbers on our side. We have the wind at our sails. They're a dying system. That's why they're doing this monkeying in Congress, where they're trying to slow the government down. So they know that any of the issues they're trying to push through would never pass a fair test. So they've got to close the government down, put a gun at the head, and say, you give us our way or we shoot. Because they know if they have to a vote, they would lose. They can only do it by blackmail.
So given the amount of money that goes into, or the fact that news sources are so often funded by large groups, large individuals, people with a lot of money and whatnot, Do you have any recommendations for either news sources or ways to determine that the news sources you're listening to aren't simply giving you the news that someone with a lot of power and or money wants you to know?
Well, let me begin by saying, of course, you could just Google a good news source, right?
You
No,
still,
I'm teasing you.
So the problem is you can, sure, you can find news sources, but you don't know it
That's
requires
what
a
I'm
lot
saying.
of digging.
But that's what people actually do. I mean, these poor people all across America, they're like, well, I got to find something, and they go, and unfortunately, what they end up with isn't always as genius as Google is. They don't always end up with the perfect news source. And so, the answer to the question is diversity and countering voices. The first thing that we get this question everywhere we go. And the first thing I always tell people is read something that you really disagree with a lot. I'm serious. I have always read, I write for The Nation magazine. Our equivalent is arguably National Review, the very conservative magazine. I read National Review all the time. It's pretty well written. I think they've become a little bit more scared of their base. But the bottom line is I still read them on a regular basis, and I find it very important. I read a lot of conservative publications because I think that helps to inform me. I also read international publications because I want to read about America from a perspective that other people see it. So I go to The Guardian a lot in Britain. I think they're very, very useful. I go to a lot of the German publications, which have great English language translation, because I'm not the best German speaker. And the bottom line is that when you start to read about how other people see you, it starts to give you a lot of perspective. I happen to like Deutsche Welle, Der Spiegel's, I think, coverage of the U.S. is actually quite good. And so go for all that. But this is the conundrum. So I hope that helps a little bit. But the question you ask gets to the conundrum we're talking about. Because all across America, I don't care who we're with. I don't care if we're in a church basement or Union Hall or in Google or wherever we're at. People say, how do I figure out what I can trust? Well, the answer to that question is you can't trust anybody. What you can trust is a diverse system that gives you a lot of different perspectives. And then you search through that, you find things that ultimately touch you, that mean something to you. And then you use all of that. But increasingly in America, people are getting a one-size-fits-all bit of news that is more likely to be defined by a negative campaign ad than by a detailed, smart bit of coverage.
And I'd just add to that, the sort of partisanization of news in America, especially cable news, is directly a function of the lack of journalism. Because, this is actually Rupert Murdoch's brilliant business move when he did with Fox News. It wasn't that he said, let's have a channel that will simply give the Republican Party talking points every night, so if you want to know what they're thinking, you can go to this channel. Instead, he said, if I don't have any journalists, if I don't cover anything, if I don't have a newsroom, what can I do to make people come to my channel? Well, you give them opinions, you give them ideology. So he hired charismatic presenters to present the talking points, and it's very inexpensive to do. I mean, John does cable news all the time. There are no reporters or people covering anything there. You've got producers and bookers, but they don't do any journalism. They just give you talking points on the issues of the day. And this reinforces the sense that people are going into their self-defined little cubby holes and not seeing what the rest of the world sees, because I will read National Review. I subscribe to The Economist and Financial Times. They're core reading for me. But I go to Fox News, and after 3 minutes, I'm bored. I know the Republican Party talking points. They aren't educating me on any interesting ideas. And I suspect conservative would go to MSNBC and feel the same way. Not to pick on MSNBC, but I think if we had...
Find you when I'm on, it's quite good.
When John's on, it's different. Yeah. But if we had substantive reporting, I think that issue about people being in their cubbyholes would disappear. Because I remember this wasn't an issue 30 or 40 years ago. We had much more substantial reporting across the political spectrum. And it was routine that people on the left would read conservative and conservative left. It wasn't considered weird. Today, it's sort of weird if you watch Fox News for any length of time for any of my friends. You think, what are you badgering yourself with this idiocy for, to be blunt?
As we popcorn off this, I'll give you one final point. I was once traveling from Jerusalem to Bethlehem on a Palestinian bus. This kid sitting next to me, and he had 3 newspapers on his lap. He had 6 newspapers, 3 Hebrew language papers, 3 Arabic language papers. And he's like 15, 16 years old. I said, what's up with that, man? Are you a paper boy? And he said, no, I try to read them all every day because I'm trying to figure out this whole thing. I mean, we got this thing with the Jews and the Palestinians and the Christians and and just, I want to get it right. Well, I mean, I love that kid, right? I mean, that's what we're supposed to do. And actually, what you folks do when you Google something, you get a lot of articles up. That's a very good model of that. But the bottom line is, again, I want to emphasize, the people who are doing that kid was a self-selected, he's probably in the Palestinian parliament today or something, or whatever. But the bottom line is, or maybe the Israeli parliament. But the bottom line is that most Americans are rushing through their lives very, very fast. It's faster than ever. And they're getting little snippets of information. And unfortunately, the constant information they get on politics, repeated again and again, is the negative ad 100 times, 1,000 times. You know that you can, in some media markets, you can see ads for a particular candidate as much as 2,000, 3,000 times before an election. You're going to remember that. You're not going to remember a little quick newscast.
I really enjoyed your previous book, Our Media.
Oh, that's an oldie.
Yeah. So I have a question about this claim that the political advertising is reducing participation.
Yeah.
Because it also draws out the fringes, right? At least that's what they say in the media. But the question I have is about a hypothesis that really previously, we had either newspapers or we had three big networks, and everyone got all of their news from the national and then the local during the 70s, like when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And now it's fractured into all of these specialized networks that echo your preferences. Before, people were educated because they had no other outlets, and so they were kind of stuck with a more broad presentation of the issues of the day. Mm-hmm. And now they don't have that. So there are things like Democracy Now! That does great reporting, but has a very small readership, I guess, or audience. Yeah. So it seems like you have to get the news, good news, adjacent to how people are living their busy lives. So that seems like a bigger problem, even though we should fix campaign finance reform.
Exactly. Believe me, we wrote this book to not make that division. You know what I mean? To say we got to fix our politics, we got to also fix our media.
In the middle of it.
Yeah. But here's one of the things I do, and I didn't do it here because I didn't get here at time. I often go when I come to a town, I go to an antique store, and I find, because they have stacks of the old papers from the town, and I get the local daily paper from 50 years ago. And I just hold it up to the people, and we go through the front page, we go through a couple pages of it. People's jaws drop. Because local daily newspapers 50 years ago, what the range of things they covered would blow your mind. They had 3 or 4 pages of international news. Even in the local paper in Palo Alto or San Jose, they had news from states around the country. I was in Duluth, Minnesota once, and I picked up a paper. It had, think about a Ralph Nader press conference from 50 years ago, or roughly 50 years ago. It had civil rights stuff. It had labor stuff, all this stuff. Well, we have squeezed it down to such an extent that it isn't just that they had 3 networks in their local paper in those days. The institutions actually gave them a lot of information. It was considered the way that you did it. And people also got magazines. They got, they had many sources. Today we have much more access to information, but in the cacophony, we don't have that easy access where you live and in your community, because that local paper that I'd pick up, in addition to all that global stuff and all that stuff from around the country, also had a reporter who was tasked every day to go cover the school board, a reporter tasked every day to go cover the city council. At the end of when you read through that paper, you knew what was happening in your community. And today, it is very hard, if you live in a suburb around San Francisco, to know what's happening in your community unless some desperate citizen blogger is out there doing the game. But the only problem with that is the desperate citizen blogger might not actually be trying to give the full story.
Yeah, I would only add the crucial point here, again, not to be Johnny One Note, is that we've lost resources to journalism. And I think that resources to journalism, people get paid, they're responsible for a beat, there's competing journalists covering it, so if someone misses it, someone else will get it. So there's that spur of competition. We've lost that. And I've made a career being critical of the type of journalism we came out of, as you know, from our media, not theirs. And the problem is that I think we've had a tendency to look at old media versus new media, and there's a split there, when that's an irrelevant concern. There are really these concerns that are using different technologies at this point. And the great crisis is that on the digital realm, with advertising no longer supporting journalism, there aren't the resources to support journalism. And it's worse online than it is in old media. That's the last place there's still funds going to pay journalists. As we lose online journalists, the reporting like John does for The Nation, he gets paid from a print publication, but he's all over the web. I mean, every day he's posting articles on the web. If The Nation can't afford to pay him anymore because they can't stay in business, then John's not writing on the web anymore. That's the irony of our times. It's old media supporting much of the original content we consider what we get when we go online to see news. And I would just, because you're here at Google, and I know this is a great concern of yours, that there's content online that you can then deliver to people and make them useful to people. This is, I think this issue of how we're going to somehow get resources to independent competing journalists who can be paid to do work and cover elections and cover communities is just foundational. And just keep that in your minds. It's certainly the issue we work on.
And one last element there. As long as Eric's here, because Eric Googles stuff, right? Just Google the Pew. Did you Google the Pew study on Baltimore? Just Google those words, Pew study on Baltimore.
From 2009.
From 2009 or 10.
Well, it came out in 10, but it was based in 9.
An incredible study that just showed how people get their information. Old media, new media, the interplay of it. I won't go into detail beyond that.
It's really
It lays it all out. We've also written some essays on it, but if you Google Pew study journalism Baltimore, most of the stuff that you talked about, it's laid bare in some incredible ways.
Well, thank you all
Thank
very
you.
much.
Wow, we love doing it. Thank you so much for having us out. It's very nice of you.